Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's mythology meetup. My name is Sheridan Honore, and I've been to a few meetups prior to COVID-19. I want to say that it's a pleasure to be here with all of you this evening, so I think I'll just dive right in. Um, I've always been fascinated by mythology, and I was very curious about trees and their place in mythology, folklore, and legend. As I began to read and study more about this topic, one of the things that I began to discover is that across all cultures, apparently, trees and what they represent, it's something that's very important in the mythology of different cultures. So let's just take a look here. See if I can. All right, so I hope that in general, one of the things that we can all do is, especially now during COVID-19, let's all try to stay grounded. Let's try to stay connected with our roots, culturally or family roots. Turn over a new leaf. This has been a very difficult time for us. Be flexible, bend before you break. Enjoy what's unique about you and do your best to keep growing in spite of whatever difficulties we are currently facing as a society. Okay, now on that note, as I said, one of the things I noted was that it seems to me that throughout all of human history, when you begin to study mythology, particularly as it regards nature and plants, it becomes apparent that trees have been symbols for humanity of, I guess, what you would call the living and fructifying force that is found in all of nature. An awareness and appreciation of this life force has been expressed by people the world over through their myths and rituals. In this presentation, we're going to take a look at just a few of the beliefs, and there's so many, so I had to kind of pare it down. But we're just going to take a look at just a few of the beliefs that humanity has held about trees and the powers that they are believed to embody. Okay. Now, one of the first places that we can look is in Celtic mythology. Um, when you take a look at Celtic mythology, that's in Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, one of the things that you see, a theme that's repeated a lot, is that trees apparently have the power to act as, and the fruits that they hold seem to act as doorways to other dimensions. I'm not exactly sure why this is, but what I found mainly in Celtic lore is that it seems that specifically the apple, so trees in general, branches, but specifically the apple, these are all things that seem to hold the power or the ability to transport people to the realm of the dead or to the realm of the gods. All right, so we're going to take a look at a few of those. Also, in terms of dealing with what they call the fae or the fairy folk, it's also believed that certain trees or boughs can sometimes act as doorways that can transport you from this dimension to the dimension of the fae. Okay. Right now, one of the first ones we want to take a look at is a story from Ireland called The Taking of Kanal. Kanal, there are a lot of legends and stories about him. He was an Irish prince, and there are some where he was trained by female warriors and that sort of thing. But in this particular story about Kanla, one of the things that happens to him is that he's able to see this beautiful fairy woman who just seems to come out of the mist. And she just basically says to him, well, you're really good looking. I'd like you to come and live with me. We can go to a land where there is no death, where there is no suffering, and where you can live for an eternity and you will never be able to get old. And one of the things that she does just before she leaves him after giving Conlon this invitation is that she tosses him an apple, which he quickly takes up. Now, Conla's father, who is the king, is very worried. Obviously, if his son is talking to the Fae, and if he leaves with this fairy woman, he will not become the king of Ireland. And so that's something that he's worried about. But in any event, over the period of about a month, Kanla took this apple and he kept eating it. But there was something magical about this apple because every time he finished it, the apple would somehow magically replenish itself or restore itself. And he would keep eating it and eating it. And so apparently it seems that the fruit of this apple, this particular fruit, seemed to act as a doorway that allowed him to reach the dimension of the fairy folk. So basically, after about a month or so, this beautiful fairy woman, she reappeared and she renewed her offer and told Kanla, you can just leave this and come to me to a land and a place where the fairy folk are, where you'll live forever, where there's no suffering, there's no death, and nobody grows old. And so his father didn't want him to go, But Conlon made that choice. He jumped on board the boat with this fairy woman, and he sailed away with her, never to be seen again. So this is just one example of trees and the fruits that they bear, which in some Celtic cultures, they're seen as doorways that act as dimensions that allow people to enter other worlds. Another story that we can look at, I believe that this one is the Welsh hero called Bran. I think he's also referred to by some people as Bran the Blessed. He also received a similar invitation where he was given a silver branch with golden apples on it. And he was basically told that he could use this as a way to get into another dimension. And so he did take the branch and he did take the offer. He gathered a group of men and they got on a ship and they decided to sail away to this other land that they had been invited to by this beautiful fairy woman. They thought that they had only been there a few months. But when Bran returned to the United Kingdom, all right, and he asked people, well, he realized that everything had changed so much. And only one person remembered him, a boy who said, yes, my grandfather used to talk about this man called Bran the Blessed. He sailed away and was never seen again. And so Bran realized that in leaving England and going to this other place, he had entered a place where time passed differently. So when he came back, he was still his same youthful self, but all the people that he knew, everything had changed. There had been a couple centuries that had passed since he'd gone away. And so once again, we see that the whole idea of the tree and the fruit of the tree can sometimes act as a dimension or a doorway. And for Bran, when he came back, nobody remembered him. And so he basically, I guess you could say, he sort of sailed into history as a result. Okay. Now, um, we're going to leave the UK and then we're going to take a look at Nordic culture. If you look at the Nordic culture, we see that, I guess I should also say that in the legends of King Arthur, apple trees also play an important role there as well. It is said that on the Isle of Avalon, where um, Arthur was taken after he was killed in that last battle, he threw his sword back into the lake and he was taken away in that boat. The place that he was taken to, Avalon, was a place that had a lot of apple orchards on it as well. So he basically, you could say that he died, but in a sense, sailing away in that boat over the water, you could also say that essentially he was taken away into another dimension, beyond the way that we usually see time here, which is linear. Okay, now when we talk about um, getting outside of the UK, if we take a look at Nordic culture, for example, all right, let's see, perhaps in Western mythology prior to Christianity, the tree from Norse mythology called Yggdrasil, that's pretty important. In Norse mythology, this tree serves as a central piece in Norse spiritual cosmology. It can probably be seen as the backbone or spine of the entire universe, with the 9 worlds of Norse mythology arrayed around it. The tree links all the different levels of the universe together. The well-being of the entire universe depends on the health and strength of this tree. In Norse mythology, Yggdrasil is said to have 3 roots. One root is planted in Midgard, which is the world of mankind. That's where we are. Another root is planted in Jotunheim, which is the world of the giants. And finally, the last root, the third one, is planted in Hel, Hel, which is considered the Norse underworld, which is not to be, I think, confused with the Christian version of that. But, okay, now, if we look at moving along there, if we look here at if you look at more recent times in terms of Christianity, all right, we have no choice but to mention the trees found in the biblical Garden of Eden. Okay, so, excuse me just a minute. All right, so of course, for those of us who are raised in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we know that basically what happens here is that Adam and Eve, they're in this garden. This is a story which is in Genesis chapters 2 through, I believe, chapters 4 in the first book of the Bible, in the Old Testament, Genesis. It talks about the fact that Adam and Eve were there. They ate this fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God in the beginning had forbidden them from doing. But they went ahead and did it. And we're told in the traditional Christian story that basically that this was a terrible sin and that they were cast out of the Garden of Eden, and then after that their life was about suffering and childbirth, etc. So that's a very exoteric, if you will, Christian interpretation of it. However, if you look at the story from an esoteric interpretation or more of a mystical interpretation, the meaning is seen sort of different. Generally, we're told that the fruit that they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is supposed to be an apple, although I've never seen any confirmation that it was in fact an apple. However, if we look at it from an esoteric perspective, some esoteric interpretations claim that what happened when they ate the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was that they fell into the world of duality. In other words, they were in a place of a timeless realm, a timeless dimension, a spiritual dimension where they didn't even have physical bodies. And so by eating this fruit, basically they left that timeless dimension and they fell into time and space. They acquired physical bodies. They experienced the world of what's called the duality. So um, generally, what's referred to as the fall or the involution of being, basically meaning leaving that timeless dimension, falling into a world of physical reality where you can experience time in a linear fashion. You know, you're young and you grow old, you get sick and you die. So, from an esoteric interpretation, once again, we see that with Adam and Eve, this tree of knowledge of good and evil and the fruit of this tree, um, it took them out of a timeless dimension. Well, it's the opposite of what happened to Kanla and Bran. Basically, by eating this fruit, they fell out of a timeless dimension into time. Okay. Now, Now, throughout world history, we find that trees, they've played an important role in various spiritual traditions around the world. When we focus on the spiritual traditions of the early Europeans, we find that tree groves were places where worship took place. Among the Celts, we find that Druids worshipped oak trees. The ancient historians, when the Romans came over and they were in Britain, one of the things that some of the historians noted was that the Celts would be gathering in what they called these sacred groves, where they did their worship. Um, let's see, the author of the Bow, author Sir James George Fraser. All right, let's see. He said that the Celtic word for sanctuary, it seems to be almost identical in origin and meaning to the Latin word nemus, which means a grove or woodland glade. Sacred groves were also found at one time in Germany. And the worship in these places was taken so seriously, in fact, that the penalty, even for just scraping the bark off of a tree in a sacred grove, was considered death. So we find sacred groves throughout the UK. They were worshipped. They were places where Druids worshipped, but we also find sacred groves in other places in Europe. You could find them in Sweden, Lithuania, Finland, and Russia, for example. Okay. Now, when we cross the Atlantic and look at Native American culture, for example, right here in New York State, we find the prevalent belief that all trees contain a living spirit. Among the Iroquois here in New York State, it is believed that not only trees, but each shrub, plant, and herb has its own spirit. Now, in Africa, trees are not only believed to be sacred as well. However, depending on where you go in Africa, some trees are considered to be more important than others, and their spirits are personified as well. For example, what you're seeing here on your screen now, this is what's referred to as a silk cotton tree. Silk cotton trees are treated with respect throughout West Africa, in part because they are believed to be the home, the abode of a god, a deity, or a spirit. Sacrifices were often made at the foot of these trees to honor the gods that dwelled in them. Among the Basoga people of Central Africa, a great deal of care was taken when cutting down a tree because it is believed that the spirit that inhabits the tree may become angry and seek vengeance on people. I mean, you need lumber, you've got to build your place. But remember, if you see a tree as a living being, or you see it as the abode of a deity or a spirit, you're probably going to think twice about cutting down the home where spirit is living. So if you need lumber to build a place, what's the solution in West Africa? How do you get around something like that? Okay. Well, let's see. Among the Basoga people of Central Africa, what they used to do there is, in order to prevent this sort of disaster where the spirit might seek vengeance because somebody cut down its home, a medicine man, or what we might call a shaman, is consulted. If the medicine man divines that cutting down the tree is okay, the woodsman can do it, okay? But they must make an offering of fowl or goat to the tree. Then, after he makes the first cut with his axe, he puts his mouth on the cut and drinks some of the tree sap. This is believed to make the tree and the woodsman brothers. Okay, so there's some sort of bonding there. But once an offering or a sacrifice is made, it is believed that the deity or the spirit that inhabits the tree has been appeased. And so once that's done, it's okay to cut it down. Okay. Now, you can also see this sort of thing is done in South Korea. It's not only in Africa. In South Korea, for example, it's believed that people who died due to plague, or if they were on the roadside, or women in childbirth, right, to appease the spirit, these spirits might sometimes inhabit a tree, like a woman who died in childbirth, or somebody who died on the road, for example. And so one of the things that people would sometimes do in South Korea is that in order to appease the spirits that live in these trees, people used to make offerings of cake, wine, or pork. They would make an offering because, once again, it was believed that some dead spirits, the spirits of some dead folks, might inhabit these trees. Okay. Now, trees, they're also more than just places for spirits to inhabit. All right. They have an important function in nature as well. Trees and the spirits that inhabit them are believed to give rain and sunshine. So they actually, it's believed that in a lot of ancient cultures that trees actually have the power to do this. It's also believed that they play an important role in fertility because they are believed to have the power to make herds multiply and to make women fertile, to make women give birth to children. So it is this last stated belief about trees that seems to have made it important for people around the world to worship them. So, for example, all right, we see this. This is a picture of from the Middle Ages. This is an etching of what we all know today as the maypole dance. Okay, now, many of the seasonal traditions that we currently have regarding trees are focused on the idea of getting them to bless people and the land with abundance. This is the reason why the May Tree or Maypole Festival is so prevalent throughout different parts of Europe. Generally, the Maypole Festival is a time when it is customary to go into a forest and people would cut down a tree, which is then they would transport it to the village and it's planted there. Okay, the intention behind doing this is people by cutting down the tree and then bringing it back to the village where it was replanted. The intention behind this act is to bring home to the village and to each house the blessing of abundance that it is in the power of the tree to bestow. So traditionally, the period of the Maypole Festival, it was also a time when, according to one eyewitness account, men and women may have spent the entire night outside in nature. It was a time basically for people to have sex, right? And so it's not just sex for the sake of having sex. Remember, we're talking about spring, all right, the Maypole Festival. You cut down this tree and then you replant it in your village. It is hope that in doing this, that you will have an abundant harvest. It's hope that you're doing this that women will have be able to give birth to lots of children. So this was something that was considered very important. And so you would see along with that that a lot of times people felt that this was an important time for sexual activity at the time of the Maypole Festival. A little bit later on in the presentation, we'll also talk about how in other cultures there seems to be a direct correlation that is made between sex and having an abundant harvest when you get ready to harvest your crops. But we'll deal with that a little bit later in the presentation. Okay. Now, the belief that trees carried a spirit of abundance, that was one of the reasons why in some parts of Europe, it was common to adorn someone in the community with green from the forest on May Day. So basically, you might take somebody out into the forest and tie shrubbery up and then bring them back into the village. And so and you're bringing this person back and they kind of look like a tree, right? So when they do that, when some villages do that, that was also the equivalent of what's known as the maypole, except in this instance, it was an actual person that was adorned in all sorts of greenery. So, all right, now this picture here, I have to be honest, this is actually what's referred to as a green man. So this is a different myth. This deals, for example, with like something referred to as John Barleycorn, which is basically the idea of the death and resurrection every year that you see in a lot of agricultural society. But I'm using this because I couldn't find a picture of the green man that's spoken about in Germany. But I think that when you understand, you'll see that they're basically the same. So, in a place called Rula, that's a town located in the central region of Germany. In the spring, what they would do is the kids would usually go out into the forest and they would choose one of their number to be what's called the little leaf man. And so what they would do is they would break off branches and they would tie it to their friend. And then what they would do is they would bring this now little leaf man. They would make a couple holes for the eyes, and then they would lead him back into the village. And so what the children would do with this little leaf man at the May Day festival is that they would go around to each house and they would knock on the door and they would ask for offerings of things such as eggs, cream, sausage, and cakes. Right? Then they would have a feast on the food that they collected. And so basically, by taking the little leaf man around to each household, what they're doing basically is by taking it to each house, and each household gives a donation of food. The little leaf man in turn will bless that household for the year, so that they have an abundant harvest of crops, or they're able to make a lot of money, or that the wife is able to bear children. Now, in other parts of Europe, in addition to having the little leaf man, one of the things that they would do sometimes is that they would dunk the little leaf man in water. All right. And so this ritual dunking, it grants him, the little leaf man, the right to go around sprinkling young women with water in the village and street urchins, I guess what we would call homeless people today. And once again, the whole point of having the little green man do that, going around sprinkling young women with water or sprinkling people who are poor, is that it's an attempt to bless them so that they are fertile, so that they have an abundant harvest. So once again, so some cultures in Europe would use the maypole. Others would use a character that they call the little green man. It just varies depending on where you are in Europe. Now, so once again, when you see this little green man, what he basically represents is the beneficent power of nature to bless people and to make them more abundance. Now, in some cultures, the spirit of fertility is actually a woman. For example, when we take a look at the Scottish Highlands, the renewal of vegetation that came with the spring, that's usually marked by the celebration of St. Bride's Day on February 1st. This period was usually celebrated when the servants in a house, they would take a sheaf of oats that had been harvested and they would dress it in women's clothing. Then they would place it in a large basket with a wooden club lying next to it. This setup was called Breed's Bed. There was a chant that the mistress and the servants of the house would then do after creating this setup. They would chant, "Breed is come, breed is welcome," right? And then in the morning, they would do a little divination by looking in the ashes of the fireplace, right? And in doing that, they wanted to see after welcoming Breed or Bridget into the home, they wanted to do a little bit of divination to see if the harvest that they would have, if it was going to be an abundant harvest. Now, uh, the Golden Bowl author Fraser, he thinks that Saint Breed, all right, might actually be a Christianized form of Bridget, the Celtic goddess of fire and agriculture. So what we might be looking at here with Saint Breed or Saint Bridget is actually the Christianized form of the Celtic goddess Bridget, who was the goddess of agriculture. Hmm. Now, Now, the final point that I wish to make here is that among pre Christian people, there was a very strong belief that the fertility of the land and sex between people for the purpose of procreation was something that was intimately connected. Um, it's almost seems to me like you can consider it a form of sympathetic magic, that by human beings doing this one act, the energy of that act was then transferred to the land. So we might go so far as to say that it seems that an ancient people throughout the world saw the force that caused things in nature to grow, and the power of procreation in humans is one and the same. Okay, for example, we already spoke about the Maypole Festival and the fact that for many people, that was a time when they would actually go out into the forest at night and have sex. Now, from a 21st century perspective, it may seem like it was nothing more than an excuse for sexual excess. But from the perspective of ancient people, it could be seen that they believed that the land could not be fertile without the active sexual union between people. For example, on the island of Java in Indonesia, it was common at one time for rice farmers to take their wives into the fields late at night and have sex with them. And as I said, they believed that by doing that, that would increase their crop yield. Okay. Now, okay, so we've taken a look at the symbolic and cultural importance of trees in a few different cultures. Now, one of the things I'd like to do is focus on their importance and meaning in the Judeo Christian tradition, right? We spoke about Adam and Eve and what was going on there in the biblical account. We know there was a tree and that they were told not to eat from it, but after being encouraged to do so by the serpent, Eve tasted the fruit of the tree, and so did Adam, which led to their expulsion from the garden, so we're told in history. Now, in Judaism, we have what is also called the tree of life. Now, the tree of life is a very important symbol that is used by people who are students of Jewish mysticism, also known as Kabbalah. Uh, the term Kabbalah, we are told, can be interpreted to mean from mouth to ear. Originally, it was considered an oral tradition, and this implies that as a spiritual tradition, basically it was handed down from one person to the other orally. Now, how can Kabbalah as best I can? I see the tree of life as a map of consciousness. And if you look at this, you'll see that there are 10 spheres here. This is an example of the tree of life here on the screen. So we have on the tree of life, it's a map of consciousness. There are 10 what are called those circles on the creator of the universe. However, what Kabbalah tries to teach us also is that the qualities and characteristics which are contained within God are also contained within us. The tree is not just a map of consciousness, it is something that actually lives within each of us as well. If we choose to study this tree and meditate on its sephiroth and paths, we will find that the energies represented by the tree within us will awaken to a higher degree of functioning. Now, the tree of life has metaphorical fruit that we can pick from its branches and consume, just as Adam and Eve ate some fruit, or just as Conle or ate tree. Well, Jewish mystics over several centuries have developed any number of techniques for traveling the paths of this tree. They include intonation, from everything from the intonation of certain god names in Hebrew, visualizations of entering different palaces, breathing techniques. And one that's very common is what's referred to as path working, which is sort of like a visualization. And so it's believed that when you do a path working and you do this sort of a visualization, that it can basically lead you to experience an altered state of consciousness and have new realizations. So those new realizations, that could be seen metaphorically as you consuming the fruit of the tree because you receive new understanding. So basically, one of the things, as I said, that you see is that if you look throughout history and through many different cultures, trees are essentially considered very important. They're not only symbols, but they're also believed in many ancient cultures to contain, a living spirit. as well as to be containers of energy that represent all of life on Earth that is constantly growing and constantly being renewed with the seasons. All right. And so you see that throughout all cultures in Africa, you see that in Europe, you see that here with Native Americans in the United States. And so also in this one particular spiritual tradition in mystical Judaism, we see that the tree basically is considered a living symbol, which if you know how to use it, you can use it to experience altered states of consciousness, to delve into your unconscious and to awaken yourself to new energies.
Thank you
So,
for the presentation. That was really interesting.
uh,
How did you collect the information?
Well, basically, I've been studying Kabbalah, so I had an interest in that. But I also like to read up on things like there's a book by a gentleman named R.J. Stewart. He's a Scotsman, and it's called The Underworld Initiation. And he talks a lot about the importance and significance of trees in pre-Christian European spirituality. So it was books like by R.J. Stewart, The Underworld Initiation, a couple books by him. The Golden Bowl by Sir Fraser, as well as some internet sources. So I just did my research as well as I also, as I said, I do study Kabbalah. And so I was able to just take a look at and see that there are all these interesting connections here and trying to see what's going on. Because basically, one of the things that I see is that prior to Christianity, it seems that the idea of death and resurrection, that's although we're told that that's a Christian motif, actually, if you look at pre-Christian cultures, such as I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the term John Barleycorn. No? Okay, John Barleycorn is a myth, I believe, that comes out of the UK. But basically, it's the idea that every spring, everything is green and it grows. And then when the fall comes, you harvest it. So it's sort of like that's death, and that's the whole concept of death and resurrection, which is repeated again. So this whole idea of death and resurrection, it's something that actually predates Christianity. You find it in the myth of John Barleycorn, and I didn't include this, but if you also look at the myth of Osiris, that's you can say that basically that the myth of Osiris is in some ways tied into this whole idea of this living force that's found in nature. Because if you look at some of the ancient paintings from ancient Egypt of Osiris, he's generally painted as green. Why is that? And he's also usually shown as iphiphalic, which basically means you'll see him. Iphiphalic basically means he has an erection. So what's going on there? What does that mean? The fact that his skin is green and he has an erection. All right, in the ancient world, what they were basically talking about, the fact is that the erection basically represents the force of life to recreate itself, to reproduce itself. And the fact that it's green, and the fact that Osiris is green represents the fact that he died. Remember, his brother Set killed him, cut him up, I think, into 14 different pieces. His wife, she rearranged him, and so she was able to actually bring him back to life. So as we look throughout different cultures at different times, the idea of trees and plants and things that grow, that die and are resurrected again, this is a common motif which actually predates Christianity by several millennia.